I'm Ian Small and I volunteer here at Severndroog Castle in the Royal Borough of Greenwich in South East London, and every day during the Severndroog Online Festival I'll be telling stories about a variety of aspects of the building from here in the courtyard outside the castle, and each story will feature a different aspect of the castle, its past, its present and its future. And today I'm going to ask the question about whether the East India Company was honourable. The East India Company called itself honourable, but today the history of the company is viewed with critical eyes. The tower was built as a memorial to Commodore Sir William James by his widow in 1784. He was the victor of a battle at Severndroog in India in 1755, a battle between the East India Company and an Indian prince over the control of access to the west coast of India. I'll talk more about Sir William, the battle and Lady James in other talks. The company was founded by charter from Queen Elizabeth I on New Year's Eve 1600 by a company of what we would now call venture capitalists, who aimed to join in with a lucrative trade in the East End and the Far East that was already being enjoyed by, particularly at that time, the Dutch and the Portuguese. The original company comprised of 250 merchant adventurers headed by George Earl of Cumberland, and between them they invested just over £30,000, which today would be more like £4 million, and they obtained a charter granting them a monopoly of trade in all countries east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Straits of Magellan. In other words, the southern tip of Africa and the southern tip of America. So they were the only English company that was allowed to trade with any countries bordering the Indian or Pacific Oceans, a vast amount of territory that included not only India but also Arabia and China and Malaya. The company was aggressive right from their very first voyage. In 1601, their very first ship got into a conflict with a Portuguese ship in the straits between what are now Malaysia and Indonesia, and they stopped the Portuguese ship and seized its cargo. They struggled at first to compete with the Dutch, particularly in the spice trade, although they did make some profit out of trading pepper from the island of Java. The company sought to get a foothold in India, and eventually they achieved that in the 17th century, at the same time fighting off rivals from the Netherlands and Portugal, and later on from France. And all of this was done with the agreement of the British government, the British Crown. Successive monarchs renewed the company's charter, and by the end of the 18th century, this unregulated company, not the British government, had control of most of India and its own private army and navy. It was trading in spices, cotton, porcelain, silk and tea, and also making huge profits from the illegal opium trade. Attempts were made from time to time to rein in the company by British Parliament, which was by now acting almost as if it was a country in its own right. In reality, the government had received massive loans from the East India Company in exchange for extending its charter and monopoly. The company was certainly engaged in the slave trade and had been as early as 1621, not only in its own right but also providing transport for slaves for other colonists. The company ceased importing slaves into India in 1811, but it continued to use the slaves it had there. And in 1833, it was actually exempted from the general abolition of slavery in the British Empire, and they continued to use slaves for another 10 years. It continued to be embroiled in wars in the 19th century. For example, it captured Aden in 1839, and at one point it seized the island of Java from the Dutch and didn't hand it back until it had stripped all the spices off of the island and replanted them in its own lands in Malaya. It had a massive army in India. The officers were all white British, and the men, the sepoys, were all local Indians. At its height, it had an army twice the size of the British Army, 750,000 men under arms, and one of its best known officers was one Arthur Wellesley, who we later on knew as the Duke of Wellington. It's possibly a sign of retribution that a cholera pandemic spread across India in 1760. And it was certainly an unhealthy environment for Europeans. It's estimated that in some colonies in India, as many as 90% of the white settlers and servants of the East India Company, 90% died of cholera and other tropical diseases. But those who survived could and did make themselves vast fortunes, and Sir William James included. The company was in financial difficulties by the 1770s. It had probably grown too big to administer its empire. At the time, it was the biggest corporate organisation the world had ever seen. And then a third of the population of Bengal died in a famine in 1770. And at that time, the world had gone into an economic depression. Acts of Parliament to protect the viability of the company's tea trade had an adverse effect on the growing tea trade in the American colonies, which ultimately led to the Boston Tea Party and, following on from that, the American Revolution. The company faced further parliamentary regulation by the end of the 18th century, and by 1833 it had lost its monopoly of trade, although it continued to be the government of India, continued to make its own peace treaties, issue its own currency, and ultimately issue its own postage stamps. It financed its still lucrative tea trade from continuing with the illegal opium trade from India into China, which ultimately led to the Opium Wars. Further legislation curtailed the company's powers of patronage and forced them to invest some profits back into the education of Indian people. And matters came to a head in 1857, exactly a century after Robert Clive had seized Bengal for the East India Company, with the Indian Rebellion, often referred to as the Indian Mutiny by English historians. After this, the company was effectively nationalised by Queen Victoria's government, who seized all of the company's assets. The organisation that once dominated world trade and commanded a massive empire was reduced to just dealing in tea until the company was officially dissolved in 1874. In other talks, I will talk about William and Anne James and the significance of the Battle of Severndroog, which is often ignored even in English text, in English history books. I've tried to provide in a few minutes the briefest mention of the complex history of the East India Company. It's a very complicated tale, and the most recent publication runs to over 550 pages in very small print, and the author acknowledges that it's far from complete. It's a history that happened. It cannot and should not be ignored. As we make use of what's left of the legacy of one woman who existed on the fringes of the East India Company's activities and who had independent means. Those of us who volunteer at the castle are not professional historians. We cannot possibly know all the answers to all of the questions all of the time that are thrown at us. If you want to know more, I suggest that you start and possibly finish with the Wikipedia pages for the East India Company, which are quite useful as a general outline and then direct you to further reading. Was the East India Company honourable? No, it certainly wasn't, not by any modern definition of the term.